Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jonathan Moore, Chief Strategy Officer for the Council of Chief State School Officers.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for making yesterday such an incredible day of connecting, sharing, and learning. I hope the opening plenary session, symposiums, and conversations with your colleagues have sparked some ideas on how to design an effective and coherent assessment system for all students, which, by the way, is the theme of this year's conference. Regular and accurate check-ins on student learning are crucial. They give us feedback we need to help students improve and succeed in their education. This field is continually pushing us to find better ways to measure how well students are learning. To design an effective and coherent assessment system for all learners, we need to consider many important components to make sure it meets the needs of students, educators, and policymakers. We know we need to spark innovative ways to measure student outcomes, address learning needs, and support educators. So we've set up this session to kickstart some inspiring conversations. Today, our plenary speakers will share some thought-provoking ideas for us to consider as we design or revamp our state assessment systems. Their presentations will cover topics such as assessment design, strategies for more effective testing, the utilization of artificial intelligence in assessment, innovative measures of student socioeconomic status, and teacher professional learning, and of course, so much more, all contributing to components of coherence. After these talks, each lasting about 5 minutes, we will hear from Peter Zamora, CCSSO's Director of Federal Relations and Policy, who will provide a federal update. He will talk about federal funding and share federal landscape analysis on K-12 assessment and accountability. This room, I wish you could see yourselves, full of smart, innovative, and thoughtful experts in different areas of education who all care about getting it right for every child. I want to thank our conversation starters. They were open to submitting proposals and sharing their ideas with a large audience. Thank you for taking the lead with your ideas. Attendees can follow up with speakers, learn more, and ask questions during the breakout sessions immediately following the plenary from 2:30 to 3:30 this afternoon. So with that, it's my pleasure to kick us off with our conversation starter presentations. Our speakers: Lisa Sereno, Assistant Commissioner, Missouri Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. Ebony Walton, Statistician, National Center for Education Statistics. Tony Alpert, Executive Director, Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium. Doris Chavez-Linville, Director, Innovation at Renaissance, and doctoral student at the University of Pennsylvania. Laura Slover, Managing Director, ETS. Sarah Boltz, Assessment Program Specialist, Fulton County Schools in Georgia. Caroline Wiley, Senior Associate, National Center for the Improvement of Educational Assessment. And of course, my colleague, Peter Zamora, Director of Federal Relations and Policy at the Council of Chief State School Officers.
Can you hear me? All right. My name is Lisa. I work at a state education agency, and like many of you here, I spend a lot of time thinking about assessment data, and how important they are to our work as educators. We're all hungry for data to help make things better, to improve outcomes for all children in all our states and across our country. Everyone seems to want more and more information about how students are performing, and we get that through testing. In Missouri, our educators tell us they spend so much time on testing that it interferes with teaching. Our statewide tests require far less than 1% of each student's overall and annual instructional time. So what's happening here? Well, we have Missouri-specific requirements for tests of school readiness, literacy, government, civics, the United States Constitution, and the Missouri Constitution, just to name a few. And this doesn't even include local benchmark or interim testing, that classroom testing, and of course the test prep that goes ahead of and into all of these tests. Now, I believe that testing is important. At the same time, right now, it feels like we test a lot. What if we tested less? What if we look for more information from the data that we have? Well, before we can talk about that, we need to understand what it is that we're getting from all these tests. At the state level, we test to understand how our students are doing academically, to gauge finished or unfinished learning, to help create a picture of the overall health of our educational system at the local and at the state level. Now, the way we apply test results falls on a continuum of accountability to practical application. At the state level, assessment data really are the foundation for our accountability systems. And those are built to drive improvement and ensure educational equity. You all know the other important uses on the application end of this continuum, but sometimes formal accountability overshadows them. Basically, it's transparency. We use data to provide information to students and parents and families, to look at the impact and successes of programs like curriculum reform initiatives and virtual learning opportunities. We use them to provide benchmarks for external uses, to triangulate local measures of student performance, and to measure changes in achievement gaps. And of course, we're still following the impact of the pandemic on our students. At the state level, we're hungry for data to help answer the questions about where we should apply resources and use them to identify supports for groups of students, especially those most educationally fragile students, and then use programs to drive instruction toward those specific needs. At the local level, we encourage educators and school leaders to be hungry for data and to use them for local planning purposes from the boardroom to the classroom, for things like informing continuous improvement efforts, and of course, most importantly, meeting individual student needs. In Missouri, we're collaborating with a boots on the ground group of districts that's using local test data to drive competency-based instruction and personalized learning for each student. Now, this may not seem new, particularly at the secondary level or to our career and technical education colleagues, but these districts are implementing and showing progress at the primary and elementary levels too. They use test data to identify student mastery, create individual learning pathways and trajectories for success. So you see, testing is important. What if we tested less? What if we look for more information from our test data? I invite you to explore these ideas with me. What if we follow the lead of our districts? What if we use local data to meet the granular needs for information? What if we downsize statewide tests? What if we implemented a matrix strategy? What if we embedded testing into instruction? What if we used all our data to not only understand how students are performing, but to create individual supports for them? What if we followed student data beginning before kindergarten through high school, into post-secondary, and then into the workforce? Data from such P20 to workforce systems exist, and they have much to tell us. What if we connected all these measures and used them to inform our work? What do you think could happen if we tested less?
On July 6, 1966, the Equality of Educational Opportunity Report showcased never-seen-before analysis on factors that related to students' achievement and academic aspirations. It revealed how various factors, such as parents' educational attainment and interests, and reading materials in the home, differentially contributed to students' educational outcomes by race ethnicity. The report also was the first of its kind to identify achievement gaps between Black and white students. Some 58 years later, the National Center for Education Statistics continues to collect data on the condition of education across America. How are students performing in various subjects, and are they making progress over time? What resources are schools and families providing for student learning? How do students, teachers, and school leaders feel about their ability to foster academic success? Are there gaps in achievement among student peers? All of these questions are connected to that 1966 report, and many of the report's findings are relevant today. For example, the 1966 report showed that up to 25% of students' verbal achievement scores was associated with factors related to family, composition, resources, and educational attitudes. A few months ago, the National Center for Education Statistics updated a tool that displays related results. Using 2022 results from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, the tool shows that 48% of the white-black score gap, almost half, and 89% of the white-Hispanic score gap in grade 8 reading also were associated with family factors, parental education, home assets like literary, computer, and internet resources, and National School Lunch Program eligibility. The significance of socioeconomic status has not waned in relevance for understanding the contributors and barriers to academic achievement. As such, the National Center for Education Statistics will release an index of socioeconomic status with the upcoming NAEP 2024 results. Around 12 years ago, the center convened an expert panel to unpack the construct of socioeconomic status and provide recommendations on appropriate applications for NAEP. Among the recommendations was for the center to develop a composite measure made up of several factors that relate to socioeconomic status. Using proxies for family resources and income, parental educational attainment, and school-level socioeconomic status, the center was able to develop a composite SES measure with NAEP data. A study conducted by the American Institutes for Research showed a marked improvement in the percent of variance in NAEP scores that can be explained with an SES index, compared to using only National School Lunch Program eligibility. The study also showed that the NAEP SES index stand out as one of the best SES measures compared to other large-scale assessments. This new SES index can create a major shift in how we examine, understand, and describe achievement of students from various levels of socioeconomic status. The potential is great, but the actualization completely depends on NAEP participation and data collection. I will discuss some of the challenges with the center's ability to present robust data for the new index, given the current state of NAEP participation. In preparing these remarks, I was struck by the rigorous analyses that researchers conducted in the 1960s, with a fraction of the technological advances we have today, and how many of their inquiries and findings mirror research we're conducting right now in the 21st century. It signifies to me that there continues to be a national concern about what contributes to educational effectiveness, and that the contributors lie within and outside of school. One side can't ignore the other. My hope is that some 58 years from now, our country will learn from the revelations that arise with new data, like the NAEP SES index, and will apply what we learn to our beliefs, strategies, and practices for a 22nd century that moves us beyond what we've experienced in the 20th or 21st. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tony Alpert. I'm the Executive Director for Smarter Balance, and today I'm going to talk about the responsible use of AI in educational measurement. So in testing, our actions are guided by a variety of statutes, state and federal law, and regulation, RFPs, the standards for educational and psychological testing, focus groups, and all sorts of opportunities and limitations and resource requirements. we've tried to address a lot of these diverse needs through the careful inclusion of technology, developing items, selecting items adaptively, scoring automatically, or automated scoring, and even incorporating technology into other applications like help desks and professional learning applications. But it's hard not to see AI as a huge shift and to recognize and be excited about the opportunities that it poses in terms of making new resources available that makes the assessment more accessible, to giving new opportunities for, to measure content that was otherwise hard to measure, critical thinking and problem solving, to increase the quality of our existing measures by incorporating systematic quality controls, to scaffold educational data and help educators and students and families better understand where students are succeeding and where they need areas for improvement. And then finally, and probably most exciting, is the opportunity to increase student engagement so they're actively involved in the test and being able to describe with more accuracy the breadth of their knowledge and skills, what they know and can do. But even with this excitement, change is difficult and it's often scary. And just about every day, we see new headlines that describe the threats that AI poses. AI is biased, AI is going to take our jobs, and it's even going to destroy the world. And so it's not surprising that people are worried. And according to the Pew Center, that concern is growing over time. And as we think about our role as supporting the public, as public servants, we know that typically there's often these barriers, these technical issues that show up, and with enough effort and focus, we can resolve those. But the most important issue and the much harder issue to solve is how do we build the trust and understanding for the people that are going to use the systems that we develop, and also support all the interest holders that are also invested in student success. So what Smarter Balanced and IBM have started to do is develop some pillars of excellence that help describe how we can successfully implement AI in measurement in a responsible way. And some elements of our approach are to maintain a student-centric focus. I think we've talked a lot about a human-centered approach to AI, which is important, but when we're thinking about educational testing, thinking about the student as a user and identifying the ways to maximize the benefits that they get out of AI and minimizing the harm is critically important. We want to include professional and personal insights from a multidisciplinary panel. These issues are complex, multidimensional, and really thorny. And bringing in a variety and a diversity of experiences can help better identify both the breadth of the problems and potential solutions. But we also want to bring those people in and co-construct the implementation, because as any panel engages, there's potential bias in the prioritization and the decisions about what to address and what not to address eventually. And so engaging that process in a collaborative manner is critical. And then finally, we want to question deeply the assumptions of both benefits and risks so that we can truly address the needs of the students. And as we're thinking about starting out, we think about use cases in a variety of different ways, a variety of different risks. That includes dimensions of whether or not it's a novel implementation or familiar implementation, and whether or not it's a background approach, quality control in the background, or whether or not it involves direct engagement with the students. And we've decided to engage in a use case discussion around the most complex issue, with the assumption that even though it's not going to be easy to address the other ones, if we fully address the most complicated case of a novel implementation where there's direct engagement of AI, we're confident that we're going to be able to identify solutions that can be applied in other settings. In our breakout, we're going to talk a little bit more about our pillars of excellence, get your feedback on how well articulated they are, and give you an opportunity to describe how you want to be involved in the work. So thank you.
Hi everybody, I'm Doris Chavez Linville, and today I'm here to talk to you about bileadership trajectories. In our world of assessment, we always want to make sure that our assessment systems are rigorous and that we are maintaining validity and reliability so that we are actually fairly assessing our students. But what if I told you that unfortunately we are today really not connecting to one specific area of the population? I'm talking about English language learners, also known as emerging bilinguals. If you think about our students who are coming to our schools to learn, and they're learning not only today in English or learning English to learn in English, but there's many of them that are in bilingual programs. So what if I told you that when we're thinking about assessment, we're also thinking that maybe validity really is not there? Why am I saying this? Well, if we think about how an expert will say that we have students that have been assessed historically in a lens of monolingualism, and actually a parallel monolingualism. What I mean by that is, I said that we assess students in English over here, we assess students many times, sometimes in Spanish over here, and we're looking at them within two different lenses. How about if we were to assess them and actually look at data results in the lens of biliteracy, really a way of looking at them through a holistic bilingual lens? What do I mean by that? When I think about a holistic bilingual lens, I'm thinking about the research that has been done at the University of Colorado Boulder for many, many years through the leadership of Dr. Kathy Escamilla and many leaders in that university, in which they are telling us that when we think about a bilingual student, it's one brain, that it is not divided in two, right? I can tell you that because that will be me. I have developed two languages, and not all the same time, and it has taken me some time to get here. So why is the Biliteracy Trajectory Project so important? Because it is an opportunity to look at our students' assets and look at them holistically. So let's kind of think about this for a second. We keep doing the same things, expecting different results. I don't know if you've ever seen these, but those are actually the lines that show us what is the gap between our English language learners and our non-English language learners in our NAEP assessment, right? We keep doing the same thing and we're expecting different results. So the important thing is that we need to remember that a bilingual are not two monolinguals in one, which means that we actually then need to think about, then how do we measure them? Are we really measuring and looking at that student holistically? Well, it is the holistic view of bilingualism. Literacy skills in two languages are interconnected. We cannot turn off one side of your brain to then turn off the other one. We are constantly utilizing both systems at once, which means that when we want to look at assessment in a valid way for multilingual learners, we want to think about the way that we think about assessment, we visualize assessment, and we talk about assessment. Because that is the way that we're going to truly be able to see a student in an asset-based view. So I invite you today to come to our session and talk about our Biliteracy Trajectories project. I'm currently a University of Pennsylvania student, and I get to be so lucky to also work for a company that has tons of amazing data, so we can connect both and start looking at how we make a big difference for our bilingual students. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello. Can you hear me? Hi, everyone. I'm Laura, and I'm thrilled to be here today. For over 100 years, the Carnegie Unit, does everybody recognize this? The Carnegie Unit has served as the currency of education. Going back to 1906, the Carnegie Unit, or the credit hour, was developed to define the amount of time students needed to spend in particular courses to earn college credit, a high school diploma, and most of us are familiar with it from our own transcripts, our parents' transcripts, our grandparents' transcripts, and you can see that on the left. That is a 100-year-old transcript, and guess what? It looks very similar to the transcripts that we have today that still serve as a basis for calculating the credits needed for graduation in most states, school districts, colleges, and universities. 100 years ago, that was a reasonable approach. Time was a straightforward constant in an era where we didn't have the psychometric sophistication that is in this room or the technology that we have today to measure outcomes. And it served to ensure that students in different parts of the country had access to equitable doses of learning. But for decades, we've known that the time-based system of education doesn't adequately capture how students learn or the breadth of what they need to succeed. I think that my entire education career, and I won't say how old I am, has been focused on solving for that problem. But the Carnegie Unit has continued to stand up because despite its imperfections, it's very convenient. And there simply haven't been great alternatives. This has also been the case with standardized assessments. So last spring, ETS and the Carnegie Foundation teamed up to launch an effort to move from both a standard credit hour and standardized assessments to a more competency-based approach. It sounds like many states are already doing that and have done incredible work moving towards competency-based systems, portraits of a graduate, in order to prepare kids for graduating and being ready to take on the world and to have more agency in their career paths along the way. So we've been talking and listening to states, many of whom are in this room, for a year and have now co-launched a design process with 5 of these states to build new measurement and insight tools to support this change. What will this look like? Okay, well, you've all just heard how many assessments we currently give and how much data we currently have. And the idea is not to build a whole bunch more assessments or even one new, better, end-of-year perfect standardized assessment. That's not our goal. What we intend to do is capture evidence of authentic learning, whether that learning occurs inside or outside of the classroom. And let's face it, kids are in school 6 hours a day, 180 days a year. But learning doesn't stop when they leave the classroom. Learning goes on all the time. Students learn at home, taking care of siblings and family members. They learn in extracurricular activities, enrichment programs. They learn in part-time jobs or through athletics or volunteer activities. But there haven't been effective ways of capturing that learning. And you can see in the left-hand circle up here a lot of places where we plan to capture learning. Essentially, we're talking about moving from a system designed around time in a classroom to one that is designed around the knowledge, skills, and dispositions that young people develop over time in multiple settings that prepare them for success in adulthood, in their communities, and in their workplaces. To do this will require new systems of capturing learning, where it happens, providing valuable asset-based insights, which you can see in the middle section of this slide, in real time so that students, parents, and teachers can help support, from an asset-based standpoint, student growth. And then portable learning records that are accepted by employers and by colleges and universities across the country and across the world. So that's super ambitious. I know you're thinking, wouldn't that be great? That would be so coherent. Everything would fit together. And that is why I'm super excited about this new work. It has the potential to drive real change. Every one of these folks up here has the potential to drive real change, and I'm excited to be able to share this with you all today. If you want to learn more, come to our session this afternoon in room 401. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm so excited to share with you the work of our district. It is one district in Atlanta, Georgia. and the work that ties into the teacher development piece that Jonathan mentioned earlier. So before we get to that part, let me just tell you a little bit about our story. So Fulton County Public Schools stretches across 70 miles in Atlanta, Georgia. We employ more than 10,000 employees, more than 6,000 teachers, and our schools are almost a pretty even split, 55% Title I, 45% non-title. Our student population also ranges in diversity. 44% of our students are Black, 24% of our students are white, 16% of our students are Hispanic, 12% Asian, and 4% multiracial. I throw all these statistics out at you to say that we are a large, complex district. And with any large, complex district, we have to make large, complex decisions. So one of our large, complex decisions was around our classroom assessments. So let's walk through this story. You can see the map that says 2021. Pre-COVID, so pre this map, our district had implemented a guaranteed and viable curriculum, taken from our state standards and adopted at a local level. We wanted to make sure that every student across our district kind of received that equity in curriculum. So let's see what assessments look like to support that curriculum as we eased back into the post-COVID life. Let's take a look at student A. Student A had a great year of learning. Their teacher used quality assessments to monitor their students' progress, to make just-in-time decisions on instruction. And when it came time for student A to take their state accountability test in May, it was no surprise that we saw consistent data points throughout the year. Let's take a look at student B. Same district, different school. Student B also had a great year of school. They had a teacher who cared about them and worked hard to create assessments at the student's level rather than the standard level. But this created a little bit of a problem because the teacher had trouble identifying those instructional gaps and then being able to close it, not providing that guaranteed and viable curriculum like with student A. And so then when it came time for student B to take our state accountability test in May, we did see some inconsistent data points with that student. So seeing these two different student experiences led our district leaders to start wondering and questioning, what is going on here? How can we fix it? And most importantly, what can assessments do to help level that playing field for those students? So this was an urgent question for our district because we knew we could not wait one more year to not have accurate and reliable data to show our student mastery or student growth. So our solution was to create common standards-based assessments built with our teachers to implement across our district. So let's take a look at what these assessments look like since their development and implementation in 2021 to where we are now in our last school year. Student A and student B had another great year of school. Their teachers used our product, our created assessments, as benchmarks for more accurate and reliable data and to make more impactful instructional decisions. The dream. And it wasn't just for student A and student B at their schools. It was for all those 6,000 teachers across our 106 schools in our district. That's hundreds of thousands of students impacted over the years. So that's our story of where this process began, and we'd like to share all of that with you in our session this afternoon. We're kind of bucketing our work into 3 different buckets. The first one is the criterion bucket. We knew that for this process to be successful, we had to establish criterion that would uniform it across the district, across our team, across our stakeholders. So we want to share with you what we've created and hope that you can use it in your work. 2, we knew that our number one stakeholder in this process were our teachers. Like we saw on the maps, we have so many teachers across our district with different practices and different backgrounds. We knew that we needed a process for empowering that teacher voice, ensuring teacher buy-in, and building the capacity of teachers when they're working with these assessments. And 3, we knew we needed to be thoughtful about how we implement and monitor this process. We've learned a lot of lessons over the years, and we have some successes and watch-outs to share with you all. So in attending our session, we really want participants to be engaged in some interactive discussions, examples, activities, because we want you to walk out with ideas and strategies that you can take back. Because why? Why is this work important? What have we learned with assessment development and revision with teachers involved? When we think about a district's assessment portfolio, classroom assessments seem like a small drop in that bucket. But actually, these assessments over the years have widened more opportunities than any other assessment in our portfolio. They've yielded high leverage next step like define outcomes of student learning and more aligned instruction, more accurate data to identify student gaps in learning, data to determine areas of need for teacher professional development, opportunities for targeted development of school leaders and teachers, and finally, reliable data that is timely within the school year and actionable. We hope to see you this afternoon in our session.
Good afternoon, everybody. So I really like to read, and I have piles of books sitting all over my house, but sometimes I get stuck just scrolling through my phone, which explains why I was reading this book, Stolen Focus. But the phrase in it that caught my attention was cruel optimism, which is defined as when you take a really big problem with deep causes in our culture, like obesity or depression or addiction, and you offer people in upbeat language a simplistic individual solution. And I think maybe that teacher professional learning should be on that list. You see, Johann Hari was writing about his frustration at trying to get a handle on how he could improve his attention span, and the experts were giving him individual solutions rather than talking about the larger design issues around how apps are designed, websites that are capturing our attention. And that's what makes me think about teacher professional learning, because I think we also have a design issue. When we focus on what individual teachers should do, that's cruel, or at the very least naive, when we don't attend to the systems that they find themselves embedded in. I think we're in trouble when we try to adapt or adopt small approaches to teacher professional learning, when we think about just-in-time, bite-sized learning that teachers can experience anytime, anywhere, on their own. When we think about creating videos that a teacher can stand in line at a grocery store to watch, a short reading that they can read while they're boiling the kettle, or a podcast to listen to while they're out for a walk or a run. We adopt this measure of teacher learning at our peril. We talk about wanting to have students engaged in deeper learning with rich, authentic tasks that allow them to collaborate and have connections to the real world, but we don't adopt approaches to teacher learning that also reflects that. Teachers need to have opportunities to have agency over their own professional learning, but then they need to be able to learn together, to apply new ideas in their particular context, to try out what they're learning, to reflect on those initial implementations, get feedback from peers, revise and adjust. This is hard work, and it's cruel to think that teachers could do that on their own without paying attention to the school, district, and state systems that they find themselves in. But what do I want a group of state leaders to take away from this when it is ironically only 5 minutes long? So 3 things. First of all, share the research. We now know a lot about what makes for effective professional learning. It takes time, it takes commitment, school-based communities grounded in the curriculum. So use your platforms as state leaders to say that to as many different audiences as possible. Secondly, then, share practical ideas. There are districts already doing amazing work putting this into practice. Again, use your platforms to be a convener of districts to share the information and the strategies that they're using. A district that I'm working with has realized that they are next year going to start their school day 5 minutes early every day, and that will allow them to have an early release time for teachers once a month, and they're currently planning how to use that time most effectively. And the third thing is invest in operationalizing this work. In the session that follows, we're going to hear from leaders in several different states. In Oregon, they have now a cadre of teachers who are action researchers focused on understanding how to support the learning for students with disabilities and English learners. We're going to hear about how Mississippi has aligned professional learning across EPPs, their regional service providers, their coaches, and 2 years of professional learning, all focused on supporting teacher learning around early childhood literacy. and they've seen real payoffs. And finally, we'll hear from the Michigan Assessment Consortium. Because of the funding that they receive from the Department of Education, from the Michigan Department of Education, they have been able to provide consistent learning opportunities around assessment for teachers and leaders for many years. Professional learning is hard and it is time-consuming work, but it is also the right for every educator to have it as part of their daily practice and not tucked into their spare time. Acting like we can shortcut this process is just cruel. But do I believe that we can do better? Absolutely. With systemic change and investment in supporting meaningful ongoing teacher learning, we can improve attitudes, effectiveness, and retention, and that is truly something to be optimistic about. Thank you.
Thank you to our keynote speakers. Now, we would like to welcome Peter Zamora, Director, Federal Relations and Policy for the Council of Chief State School Officers.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm very glad to be here. What a tough act to follow and a great session. And this is actually my first attendance here at the NCSA conference, and I've learned so much that I'm going to be bringing back to Washington, D.C. to help to inform our practice on behalf of states at the federal level. But today I wanted to take about 20 minutes or so to provide a sort of brief snapshot of everything that's happening and not happening in Washington, D.C. to help to inform your thinking around federal policy and federal practice. So again, I'm the Director of Federal Relations and Policy at CCSSO based out of DC, and what we will focus on today is our sort of tour of Washington, D.C. We'll start in Congress, focusing in particular around federal funding issues, FY25 appropriations. Then we'll talk some about federal education assessment policy, both at the U.S. Department and then also talking about some marker legislation that's been dropped in Congress recently. And then I will conclude appropriately with a few conclusions here to sort of take away and inform your thinking. But first, I wanted to level set and present some context for, I'm sure many of y'all have been following in the news. It's been a super interesting Congress, but it is ultimately a very narrowly divided Congress. And so there on your left, you'll see the composition of the Senate, and it's 51-49. So technically, it's 47 Democrats, 4 independents who caucus with the Democrats, and then 49 Republicans. So it's technically, I guess, a 2-vote margin because the vice president is a Democrat who would vote with the majority, presumably, but basically a 1-vote margin. And then in the House, the margins have actually gotten narrower over the course of this Congress, and we're now at 218-213 under Speaker Johnson, the Republican majority, with a few vacant seats, but it takes 217 votes to pass legislation, most legislation in the House, and so a 1-vote margin. And so this is historically narrow margins, and as a result, perhaps unsurprisingly, it has been a historically unproductive Congress as measured by legislation passed. So this is a nifty little bar graph here that I pulled from Axios, and you'll see those are the numbers of bills that were passed in prior Congresses, and then all the way there at the right side of the screen there, you'll see the first session of the current Congress, 118th, and they passed only 27 bills in 2023. And that includes naming VA hospitals, that includes a bill to recognize the 250th anniversary of the U.S. Marine Corps. So to say that this is an unproductive Congress is almost an understatement at this point. But that said, the one thing that Congress does have to do, at least in theory, is to fund the federal government to keep the lights on, including funding some of our key education programs. And it's been a very chaotic funding process in this Congress. If you've been following along, we've come very close to a couple of shutdowns, though have yet to see a shutdown in this Congress. But we are currently looking forward to the fiscal year 25 funding cycle. October 1st is the first day of fiscal year 25. But what we have seen in the Biden administration is their budget proposal, it's just a proposal, would be relatively or really quite modest increases for Title I, for IDEA, level funding for Title II. Title III would get another small boost, but nonetheless a boost. It has seen increases in recent years. Arguably not sufficient to meet the need, but it has been on an upward trajectory. But then, obviously for the purposes of this discussion, state assessments grants saw a haircut, $10 million, quote unquote haircut, $10 million reduction in FY24. That was not consistent with the administration's budget proposal, but at the end of the day, we're working under very hard caps, and I'll talk about that. And I think the state assessments, and it will come from the competitive funding stream, we'll talk about it here more in a moment, was perceived as having a less immediate impact upon students versus your Title I, your IDEA that'll directly fund classroom supports for kids. So as we kind of think about budget and appropriations, a few takeaways. This is not radical interpretation here. It's pretty obvious that this is a very challenging fiscal climate. Congress negotiated budget caps as part of the debt ceiling agreement early on, and there's some disagreement as to what they actually agreed to, but nonetheless there are very hard caps, and so appropriators are having to navigate between different priorities, and it's a very challenging fiscal climate. CCSSO continues to advocate on behalf of education programs that are valuable to states, particularly focusing on the biggest and the most flexible federal programs, and then supporting states, particularly in offloading ESSER-funded activities onto your recurring federal formula grants as a mechanism of sustaining them. And that's really what we have seen has been, some eliminations or reductions of smaller programs, but the bigger programs have either been level funded or have seen slight increases, except for the state assessment grants. Now, the way that the state assessments grants works is that if it's funded at up to $369.1 million, those funds go to states for their state assessments. Money above that then is administered in this competitive state grant or grants for state assessment, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But it's quite clear at this point that we're not going to see another round of COVID relief funds. There's not going to be an ESSER 4, and so there will be fiscal pressures. This is, again, not news to you all, certainly, in the field, but that is going to increase coming up. But given the fiscal pressures, the competitive grants for state assessment becomes an even more critical funding mechanism for assessment innovation. And just to bring you up to speed on where we are today, in FY22, the department made grants to 11 states. They are currently in an application review process now, under which 17 states submitted, my understanding is 20 applications for CGSA funding. The priorities were multiple measures of student learning, competency-based education. At least in theory, applicants needed to have planned to apply for IDEA funding or for IDEA authority, which we'll talk about again here in a minute. But then in the president's budget request for the next fiscal year, he proposes again $20.9 million, which is a significant funding stream. However, we saw the cut in FY24. We're continuing to see potential challenges ahead for FY25, and it has yet to really be determined. The department has yet to determine how they're going to navigate the slight cut that we saw in FY24. Will that be in this round of competition, or could it potentially be in a subsequent round? It is clear that the department is currently in the review process, and they will make the awards by September 30th of this year. Probably not much before September 30th of this year, but stay tuned for that. And also FY25, there's a focus on high quality formative and diagnostic assessments, and then also support for innovative states participating in IADA. And many of y'all are probably deeply aware of the IADA requirements and the administration's letter that was disseminated back in November of last year. Did make, I think, some positive changes. It lifted the cap on the number of states that could participate, though we had never actually seen the department hit that cap. They nonetheless lifted it. It clarified some of the methods for demonstrating comparability. And clarifies timelines and gives states a potential for a planning period. I think that's all good stuff, but CCSSO has continued to advocate that it is unduly burdensome, more burdensome than it needs to be. Much of that is statutory, but nonetheless, we have not seen states clamoring to participate in this, and in the most recent window that was opened up, no states submitted an application. So, as we conclude our kind of focus on the administration here, the Biden administration, after 3.5 years, we can say with some authority that they are committed to assessment, committed to current law, and would like to see more innovation under current law, whether that's through peer review or through IADA or through their broader waiver authority. But again, they continue to be committed to annual assessment. So. That's the administration, and let's spend a few minutes talking about Congress. And before we dig into a couple of marker bills that I want to highlight just for our discussion here, just again, level setting, context setting, ESEA reauthorization, which contains the main federal assessment provisions, is not imminent. It is not going to happen in this Congress, probably won't happen in the subsequent Congress. There are a lot of discussions underway with thoughtful folks that we work with in DC, but they're not writing bill language to drop, and that would ultimately reach the president's desk. And in fact, no recent K-12 hearings focused on assessment policy or accountability policy, for that matter. Again, lots of discussion behind the scenes, but very little sort of open and public. But members of Congress have introduced marker bills recently that I want to talk about a couple. But again, don't want to elevate these unduly, because these do not reflect the consensus, because currently there is not a consensus at the federal level around what the appropriate federal assessment policy should be. But the bill that has probably gotten the most attention in this Congress is one that was dropped by Jamal Bowman from New York, and it's called the More Teaching, Less Testing Act of 2023, or HR 1741. And it's interesting timing that I'm here delivering this presentation today, because it's actually primary day in New York today, and Congressman Bowman has a very competitive primary, and it's not at all clear that he's going to win that primary. So lots of eyes upon New York these days. But I flagged this legislation more for the buzz and the sort of sense of what it means in context, rather than the individual himself. Although he is a very interesting, if you're not familiar, former middle school principal, very active member of the Committee on Education and the Workforce, and a guy, he was on Colbert last week. He gets out there, he's sort of very active and engaged. But with this bill, there are 25 co-sponsors. He's the lead sponsor. There's 25 original co-sponsors that were on it when he dropped. And they're all Democrats, but they include co-sponsors from the Congressional Black Caucus, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, and the Congressional Progressive Caucus. And so there are many folks, I think, historically and recently, and certainly in this room, that have viewed assessment as being a tool to promote equity. That is not how this bill really situates at least current assessment policy. And so these are, again, marker bills, political statements, and ways to organize constituents and members. But just sort of leading off here, the sense of Congress states that ESEA assessment requirements limit classroom instruction, promote memorization over critical thinking, that the overuse of standardized testing takes a negative toll, and notes that assessment accountability should focus on deeper learning for equitable purposes. So what does this bill do? This would modify, it would amend ESEA's assessment requirements to allow states to either assess as they do now, or to use a sampling approach, and there's definitions of what that sampling approach could be, or assess once in each grade span. And it would also make some of the changes to IADA that the administration has already made in their letter from last November. And it would prohibit states from using assessment results as the sole or the dominant factor in grade retention, high school graduation, or teacher evaluation. But what's maybe most interesting about this bill, because we see dozens or hundreds of bills introduced in each Congress that don't go anywhere, and to be very clear, this bill is not going to be made into law anytime soon. And it's a marker bill that's intending to influence the discussion. Maybe that some of those principles would make their way into final legislation, but this was endorsed, certainly by AFT and NEA, the teachers' unions, but also by NAACP. One of the largest, most important civil rights organizations in the country. Also Education Law Center, which engages in advocacy and litigation on behalf of educational equity. National Indian Education Association, and the First Focus campaign, that's just a sort of short list. Meanwhile, it's been opposed by the Education Trust, disability rights organizations, and so it represents a bit of a fissure between, I think, some of the organizations and their views on assessment, and definitely something that has generated a lot of buzz and is worth noting. Also wanted to flag a marker bill from the right, from House Republican Debbie Lesko from Arizona. And this is a more sort of common, and we've seen these pretty regularly over the years, and it's really situated in federalism and in kind of states' rights, and that it would basically allow states to consolidate their ESEA grants into a block grant. It would continue to require some, well, let me get to that in a minute. It would it would eliminate the assessment and accountability requirements, continue to require annual reporting of student performance, but that would be decided at the state level. But the short version, the short way to think about this would be that this makes it a block grant and defers to states in terms of how, or really whether, to engage in assessment and accountability and what that looks like, and to define subgroups in ways that are consistent with state priorities. So, I know I've gone through a lot here, so let me see if I can just back up for a minute and offer a few kind of high-level conclusions. First of all, from an advocacy lens, CCSSO continues to support effective and coherent education or assessment systems. On some level, that goes without saying, because it's literally the theme of the conference, and we heard that from Jonathan earlier, and certainly Carissa. This was front and center of our discussions yesterday also. But that is actually very important for policy and political reasons. CCSSO was deeply engaged in the negotiations that led to the successful reauthorization of ESEA in 2015, that led to the ESSA provisions. We continue to be at the table. We continue to basically help to define sort of the contours of the reasonable in the advocacy debate, and want to build consensus, are building consensus that will ultimately lead to reauthorization. It's also pretty clear where we're at now that there's not real engagement amongst congressional leaderships to reauthorize ESEA. So, that could be read as tacit support for, existing annual assessment requirements. I talked about a couple of bills that, would move away from the annual assessment requirements, but, right now there's not a concerted effort from leadership and chairs to change current law. Also, I know many of you all have been interested in the reauthorization of the Education Sciences Reform Act that has some improvements to the National Assessment Governing Board and particularly NAEP administration and the NAEP timeline. CCSSO is very supportive of that and has been engaged on that topic. It's touch and go to see what's going to be able to happen in this Congress around that. However, federal inaction, and I'm sure many of you all would agree with this, is not necessarily the worst thing. And there's sort of an inverse relationship between the amount of new federal requirements and our opportunity at the state and local level to innovate. So this is our time to innovate, and I've heard such great innovation both on the stage here today and yesterday and throughout. And I think part of our challenge and our opportunity is how do we, package up all of this innovation, present it to our members of Congress who are leading and are leading in support of you all, of the education system. And so, this is an opportunity to innovate both in practice, and again, the AI stuff and everything else is really exciting, and then also in policy. I mean, do we currently have the right mix between accountability and assessment, and what should that look like moving forward? Right now, there's no consensus. We can help to form that consensus here in that room, and then, CCSSO will package that up and bring that to Congress for a future reauthorization. But that said, this is a very different dynamic. This is not 2015, it's not 2014. There are certainly new fiscal pressures that weren't present there, and then also political pressures would change. Historically, the coalition that brought us standards-based accountability was really business, civil rights, and reform-minded education leaders. Now that could be changed with different types of coalitions, and I think we saw here a couple of examples of kind of left-right coalitions that could potentially find some alignment. But that said, again, you all are doing the work, and we're here to support you here at CCSSO. We will be informed by your innovation, your development. We'll definitely bring that back to DC, and it's just such a pleasure to be here with you all and serving you as you work to serve kids. And again, I'm Peter Zamora, and look forward to our continued work together. Let me bring Jonathan back to the stage. Thank you. Thank you.
Wow, so much great information. Can we give our speakers another round of applause? What a great series of talks to get our conversations rolling. I certainly hope you found them as valuable as I did. Those of you in attendance who will also participate in CCSSO's collaboratives might want to continue these conversations at your meetings this Thursday and Friday. Some of the collaboratives focus on topics closely related to state assessment and accountability systems, including those on this slide. Additionally, we have many sponsors who help make this conference a success. If you haven't had a chance to connect with them, you can visit them in the exhibit hall located in Elwa Level 5. Can we give a round of applause to our sponsors, please? I'm also thankful to our planning committee, who dedicated their time to review and evaluate more than 230 proposals. They also reviewed all the videos submitted for the plenary session, ensuring we had a great mix of content, quality, and balanced topics. Please join me in giving them a round of applause. Their support to the council and their determination truly make the conference the best it can be, and we are greatly appreciative. Next, perhaps the most fun part of the evening we have to look forward to is the reception this afternoon. From 5:30 to 7:30, it will be held on Level 7 in the Regency Ballroom. We want to thank Pearson for their gracious hospitality of this evening's reception. Lastly, next year's conference will be held in Denver, Colorado from June 23rd through June 25th, so please save the date. Thank you all for attending today's plenary and enjoy the rest of the conference.